Hello and welcome back to another video. I'm Zelp and today we are looking at some comments and answering some questions. I feel like there are a lot of very interesting and very good topics, so do stay tuned for them. Now the first one is about critical modding. Like I did say in my last video that if he has a really low base critical, then it's not worth modding because the base stats or critical damage and also critical chance plays a huge role in the outcome. So the question here is that how much does it need or how much does it require in order for it to be worth for this specific weapon? Now the way he asks it is that he says, could you tell us the base critical chance that we need to see in order to make point strike relevant? And it's not something that I can just answer you because again there's so many factors. You're asking about critical chance, but as we established, the critical damage plays a huge role as well, because if you have all the crit in the world but really low critical damage multiplier, then it's not going to mean much. Then there is also what are you relating to. So in our last video we are deciding if we should use 4 elemental mods or at 90% damage, or we should use 2 critical mods, which is point strike and vital sense. The weapon category also plays a huge role. For example, for primary weapons, if you're using a shotgun just does not have really good critical mods, and that's not gonna appeal much. Even if I say like, oh, you need at least 20% critical chance, for example, it's not gonna appeal much because the shotgun mods only increases like 90% of critical chance, whereas a rifle one increases 150%. And also if you're using, let's say, melee weapon, they have their own system which could actually help them boost their critical chance a lot more. For example, using blood rush, and because of that one mod, it can actually make a not so critical viable type weapon to become critical viable, and that requires a whole different testing to itself. Now however, I do not want to leave you hanging. I feel like we should still kind of address this in some way. I want to give you a solid answer that based on your question I can still kind of give you, because you say, for example, what if a weapon had like 10% of 8% for the example that I gave in the last video. So I'm going to put all the factors, all the variables based off the last video for the MK Breton. So to be honest, the base damage of a weapon really doesn't matter because it can be really low, it could be really high, everything just scales accordingly. So the method of scaling is what that matters. So therefore what you're comparing with matters, and also what is the weapon's base critical damage multiplier, that will matter as well, because we are changing its critical up and down to see what would be best for that particular critical multiplier, for example. So with the same exact case as my last video, how much critical do you need to be better? So basically we're finding a turning point where we can say that, oh, with this amount of critical chance, then you should go for a critical build, etc. Okay, so what I did was I used the yesterday spreadsheet, I copied it out, and then I removed anything that's not relevant. I changed the 100 damage to 1. So basically we're all looking at percentage instead of a sort of like a damage representative. And then I introduced multiple columns to see if critical chance were to vary for every 1%, slowly cranking up and higher all the way to 100%. At what point does the weapon's base critical chance need to be in order for it to be more viable to have point strike and also vital sense? So do keep in mind that this is going to base off of rifle weapons, and it's the same condition. Basically we're comparing, should we use 4 90% elemental mods or 2 and then 2 critical, and when is that turning point? At what base critical chance should you use go for critical instead of going for 2 elemental mods? Okay, so right here you can actually see that on this column you can see all the critical chances slowly ranking up from 1% to 2 to all the way to 100%. And then the next one is something that you might want to change depending on the situation. So right now we are testing for the MK Breton that has a base critical damage of 1.5 multiplier. and then we're going to put in the mods. So the mods for a rifle weapon is going to be critical chance 1.5, and then the critical damage at 1.2. Which is how much the amount has been increased. Then when you mix them up together, you get your new critical chance and also new critical damage. And then based off of this, we come up with the base. Remember, one without mods and one with mods. So we have the base multiplier and the multiplier after adding the mods. And then we can actually find the difference to know how much it actually increased. Because remember that when you have 4 elemental mods and not have any critical mods on, the base multiplier still applies to those damage because it comes with the weapon. You don't have to mod it. And then this is when you have critical mods on. So basically the two conditions that we are checking is one where you have only 2 elemental mods, 2 critical mods plus this base, and another one is just with 4 elemental mods plus this base. And you can see the percentage over here. So obviously the higher number is going to be the one that has better damage. And you can see at the start, if you have really low critical chance at only 1%, obviously the one with 4 elemental mods is gonna win. But if you look at the yellow one, this is where the turning points actually occur. You can see that at 14%, having 2 critical mods and 2 elemental mods actually wins against having 4 elemental mods. So at 14%. So what does this even mean is that if you have a weapon that is a rifle and it has a critical multiplier, critical damage multiplier for its base at 1.5, when you reach at least 14% critical chance, you should go for critical based off this scenario, you know, between going for critical or going for another 2 more elemental mods. Where else, if you increase this, that means if I have a base rifle weapon that has, let's say, two base critical multiplier, then you'll realize that the turning point is the purple one or the pink one, which is, as long as it has at least 10%, it's better than having 4 elemental mods. Having 2 elemental mods and 2 critical is better than having 4 elemental. And then if it has, you know, this is the highest one, but if it has 3 critical damage, then all you need is the 6% critical chance for the base in order for that weapon to be critical viable. And I think this is a very good question, and it also kind of creates a scenario where you can kind of see that, oh, actually all you need is maybe 14%, even at its lowest, one of its lowest at least, at 1.5 critical multiplier. The way I get these values is really just going to the weapon comparison on wiki, and then I check for critical damage and I look through. So there is one that is even lower at 1.4. This 2 is not applicable, I'm not really sure. Oh, similar. And then after that, I realized that one of the common ones is 1.5, another common one is 2, and then after that it's kind of a mix, but the highest is going to be 3, multiplier of critical 3. So this is why I took this 3 as a comparison, the yellow, the purple, and also the blue. So thank you for asking the question. You can actually play around with this if you want to, but you do need to know how to make the multiplier work so that you can compare. And you can also actually change these values if you so want to as well. You know, if you want to put a different mod instead of point strike, like if you want to use the shotgun ones, then you have to change all these values to 0.9 because shotgun's critical. Was it blunderbuss? I think that's the mod called. The next question is basically asking if hybrid is always the way to go, and it's not always the way to go. It really depends on the characteristics of your weapon, because sometimes if it's just so good for critical, it's better to sacrifice an entire multiplier just for critical sometimes. Now what's interesting about this comment, if I continue to read on, it says because with pure critical it only makes sense if you have 100% critical chance, so you can constantly get the multiplier. But if you can't get 100% crit but you can get 100% status and go for, okay, what he's trying to say here is that you benefit a lot if you can go past 100% critical chance, and because you can keep getting that multiplier. And this is where I begin to think like maybe that's not the case. So hence, because of this comment, we are going to try and prove if there is an extra benefit by reaching that 100% critical chance cap. Now, upon reading this, to be honest, I was actually convinced. I was like, oh yeah, you have every single shot that you do will gain that multiplier, and therefore it should be a lot better. But the more I think about it, when you have 99% critical chance, most of your shots is going to be doing that extra. So if you have 100, all of the shots are going to be the increment in percentage seems to be subtle. It seems to be similar. And then when you have 110, they're all going to do that amount, but you have a 10%, which is a very small amount of chance of doing an orange crit that gives you a boost, a slight boost. But then 90%, because before when it's 100%, every single one does a yellow crit, but now only 90% of the damage does yellow crit. So you are lowering one part to increase another part. And then suddenly it felt like actually it doesn't matter. So back to the spreadsheet, over here we have another one, and basically what I did was, again, I try to remove anything that is not really that useful, and then I put just two simple columns. One is critical chance and another one is total damage. Then I manually increase the critical chance, the new critical chance, the one that is actually used in the formula. So instead of, meddling with the weapons base and also the mods, I just straight away change the end product. So over there I change it to 0.5 to see how much total damage I would receive. Then I change that to 0.6, so I up it by 10%, and then I see how much damage it does. And from what I can see, the total damage when you increase, in this scenario with a critical multiplier of 1.5 at least, every 10% critical chance I increase, 5% damage will increase. This is only because my critical damage multiplier is relatively low at 1.5 only. So by doing this over and over again, I check for 50% critical chance, 60% critical chance, 70, 80, 90, and this is where it gets interesting. We go to 100% critical chance. It seems like the increment is still somewhat the same, and then finally we went to 101. Every single step seems to have increased by 5% damage, and it has no changes as well, even though it surpassed that 100%. Now I was a little bit skeptical about this because I was kind of convinced by the comments, so I double checked the formulas and everything seemed to check out. So I want to show you why this is slowly. So if I were to go to 90% critical chance, okay, at 90% critical chance, you can see that its normal attack only does 10. Okay, because you have to imagine only 10% of your damage is going to produce some form of damage. So it's only 10 where it doesn't crit. But then there is the 90% that will crit, and those 90% which crits will have an extra 1.5 damage multiplier that gives you a total of 135. If you don't know how this value comes about, it's basically 90 damage because we are doing 100 damage per hit. So therefore 90% of the 100 damage is going to be 90 damage, and that 90 damage is going to increase by 1.5 damage multiplier, which will give you this 135 damage. So that is how it's calculated. Now you might find that why isn't it +1? So why isn't it 2.5 instead of 1.5 is because this is not the mod. If it's the mod, because we actually set the mod to 0, if this is the mod that like Vital Sense that increases 120%, you actually have to bump that up to 220%, but this is the base stat, so how much it actually increase based off its weapon, and you don't have to add that. So therefore we have this amount. Now I want you to look at what happens when it becomes 100%. Right now I can already tell you the normal attack supposedly becomes 0, and then the critical damage, everything will become a yellow crit, so everything will become under the critical damage. But because of the way I set, or the way I formularize this thing, is that when it gets to 100%, the new normal is yellow crits. So this is when all the damage becomes a yellow crit. The actual crit is going to be an orange crit. So you can see that now the normal is 1.5 out of the normal damage. So how much does it increase from this point to this point? You can see that it only increases by 5 damage, because this one at this one is 145, and then when it becomes everything crits, it does 150 damage, and there's no additional crit because it's 100%. unless it's 110%. So now when it goes to 110%, you see that when it does an orange crit, it does this much, okay, 20 damage, but the remaining 90% does not crit, so it's still the minimum. So therefore, if you look at the increment, it's still only 5 damage. So therefore, the damage increase is still a subtle, linear 5% for every 10% critical chance you increase. So therefore, there is no real reason for you to hit that 100% besides, I don't know, visually to make it look nice because all the yellows keep coming out. So there is a comment telling me about headshot criticals. And apparently there is a extra damage or some kind of multiplier involved in it. Like if you look over here, there is the headshot multiplier, and then there's also somehow a 2 times over here, which I'm still not really sure how that would actually result in the final outcome because I haven't played with the formula yet. But it does seem to do an even more extra damage if you could crit on a headshot or a body part multiplier. So I guess maybe in that sense, hitting that 100% may have this added advantage. So without doing all this math, to be honest, I don't even know. Like I actually thought and I was convinced that when you can reach that 100% mark, things is going to be even better by a certain fold. But turns out it's actually the same, so you don't really have to stress yourself, you know, add another mod just to reach the 100% in order to get, so it doesn't matter. Okay, your damage multiplier is still going to be the same. What you want to do is again have multiple damage multipliers. Now next and final comment that we'll be looking at is someone just basically saying if you want to compare damage with mods and without mods, just go to Warframe Builder. Now this website is really old. Like I remember using it back in the days when I first started, and there's a reason why I stopped using it. I made a video talking about its inaccuracy. There were a lot of flaws back then, but I feel like right now, coming back to it after so many years because someone mentioned it, I feel like a lot of things have been fixed and it seems like it's a lot better. Now some of the differences between using this to compare and using my spreadsheet is that over here it compares with damage values. Mine kind of shows you the percentage increase. Over here there is some benefits, like they have burst DPS and sustained DPS. I guess burst DPS is where they don't take into account reloading, and sustained DPS is where they put in, you know, your reload speed and the amount of ammo that you have before you need to reload, things like that, which is also something that I kind of want to do for the speed multiplier that we talked about in the last video. Now one thing I realized is that when you put on something like Point Strike into a Breton, for example, you'll see that the values, the base value actually increases straight away and gives you an extra total damage. So they already straight up create an average similar to what I did and give you a value. So this means that if you do not have it on, it might be confusing. If you have it empty, you'll find that the values over here is not the same as the original Breton Prime. Sorry, not Prime, MK1 Breton. So you can see it's 4.5, 4.5, 9. But if you go over to Warframe Builder, you'll see that it is 4.68, 4.68, 9.36, because they have already included its base critical chance and also critical damage multiplier, which doesn't really affect the outcome. In fact, this way, when you put everything in, your damage outcome or the results is still going to be the same and still going to be somewhat accurate. So I think it's actually good. Like, there's no reason why you cannot use this. I do find it a little bit troublesome trying to find the things that I want when I already know that Point Strike has 150%. So for me, it's a little bit easier to just type it out, what I know and what I want to put in, rather than to try and look for the mod and put it in myself. But from what I can see, yeah, it's good. However though, it doesn't seem like they have a way to calculate average DPS based on status, which is something that we'll be doing in the next video. To be honest, I wanted to do that in today's video, but upon reading some of the comments, I realized that, oh, those are some really interesting and good topic, and also things that I kind of want to figure out myself, which is why we did today's video this way. Thank you again for all the comments. I'll like to see more, and if it's interesting enough, we'll talk about it. I would like to point out that those that is featured in this video, your comments, you are eligible to win a glyph away. Just PM me on Discord. I'm sorry that I didn't read out your names because I have a fear of getting it wrong, and I really don't want to butcher your name. So Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye bye.